Did you hear about BRICS? They're gonna take out the US dollar and take over the world. They just had their summit, and they're gonna announce their new currency. BRICS, 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 BRICS.
I mean, I've slightly touched on it in a couple presentations before, but we never really got into the nitty-gritty of BRICS. Every time I hear BRICS, I think of a brick phone. Online, we are being inundated with Xi and Putin fanboys all saying the same thing. And with the recent BRICS summit, the fanboy chatter has gotten even worse. The reality is, Xi didn't show up for most of the summit's ceremonies, missed important speeches, the Indian flag was thrown on the ground after the Indian PM's remarks that weren't too flattering for BRICS, and a couple of members raised doubts on rivaling the US. Did we see any of the BRICS bros mention any of those things? Of course not. I'm going to trigger the BRICS bros, the Putin and Xi fanboys, with what I'm about to say. What if I told you that things we saw from this recent summit and other factors prove that BRICS is just a LARP through point by point that these BRICS bros make and absolutely destroy their circle jerk narratives about BRICS. So the BRICS summit for 2023 just took place last week. Leaders from the BRICS countries met together and talked over whether to let in new members or not. We'll get into why this BRICS summit resulted to a big nothing burger and actually made BRICS success less likely in the future. And we saw a couple of controversial events take place in the summit itself. But before we get into it, let's give a quick background on the origin of BRICS for the people who may not know. BRICS was a term coined by a Goldman Sachs employee, Jim O'Neill, but really it wasn't even him, it was his assistant that coined the term back in the 2000s. He wrote up a paper saying how Goldman Sachs should invest in big bond markets. And it just so happened at the time, Brazil, Russia, India, and China had some big bond markets. The project, after a few years, got abandoned by Goldman Sachs, but the moniker BRIC, and eventually BRICS, adding in South Africa, stuck into the mainstream. And for those of you that don't know, BRIC is an acronym that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then later, in the years after, they added S for South Africa. And ever since, it's stuck in the mainstream, that whole moniker. But that's literally the origin of BRICS in a nutshell. It's not this grand thing people are making it out to be, and here's more reasons why. So the countries in the BRICS group, even after the project in Goldman Sachs was abandoned, continued to use the moniker and thought they could form some type of unofficial union. But what has the BRICS group done so far as an organization? Not much at all. So they formed a development bank. It has tens of billions, which, by the way, is tiny in the grand scheme. It's no bigger in size than one regional bank in the US. So look at that for some perspective. Worse off, 90% of the capital in this development bank comes from China. Why China? Well, it's simply just because China is a big trading partner. That's it. No other special reason. Some commentators are speculating that this development bank is going to issue a global currency that will bring down the dollar. But China, South Africa, and the bank itself has openly expressed their lack of interest in implementing a global currency before. Sometimes we hear them talking about the global currency again to challenge the dollar, but as soon as they start talking over the brass tacks of the whole details on how that's going to be implemented, the whole conversation falls apart. Because you see, it's all rhetorical. When it comes down to it, they can't even constructively work out details on how this supposed currency could even work. Now, the narrative we're being spoon-fed is that BRICS is putting together an alliance and trade agreements that will destroy the US reserve currency status. But let's see what they've done so far with trading with one another. Russia, besides exports going to China, doesn't trade with the rest of the BRICS members. And same with Brazil and South Africa. So the question is, can all of the BRICS members even get along with each other in the first place? And it's looking unlikely. Let's go through why. Now, historically, when an organization like this grows like what we've seen with BRICS, you either enlist more members And that actually makes the organization really not effective because now you have conflicting members. Or in the second historical outcome, the organization, a top-heavy member becomes the governing overlord of the organization, which a good example of that, of course, would be the US in NATO. Let's start with Russia in this whole BRICS alliance. Russia this whole time, or really in most cases, thinks everyone wants to join up with them and divest the West until they get their way with Ukraine. They're very much one-way minded. They think everyone should use the ruble, their currency, which is really unrealistic, especially with the sanctions. Even the BRICS members are, for the most part, staying away from trading with Russia. And let's face it, the Russian economy is minuscule. It's roughly the size of the economy in Texas. India and Russia got into it recently because both countries made snarky remarks on how the opposing country's currency is worthless. That's what they said about each other. And it's worth to note, India and Russia do not trade with each other, or do they get along, clearly. Russia and the recent new BRICS members do not get along, and we'll go into that later. Russia and China's relationship is just a romance out of convenience, but it's more in China's favor than Russia's, this whole relationship. After the sanctions, Russia converted a bunch of their money into yuan, the Chinese currency, for what they thought were safety reasons. And a few months later, when they tried to give back the yuans to China, China said, no thanks, we don't want those back. So now Russia is stuck holding the bag on the yuan, which has been going down in value dramatically with the ongoing Chinese deflation that we're seeing. Now, Russia's relationship with South Africa isn't too great either. They compete with one another economically. And given the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin, the war crime of unlawful deportation of population, which in this case were children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Now, Putin decided not to travel to South Africa for this recent BRICS summit because of those reasons. South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court and is signatory to the Rome Statute. So it would ostensibly need to cooperate with the court to arrest Putin if he traveled to South Africa for the summit. Obviously, that's why Putin couldn't even show up in person. After Putin's virtual pre-recorded comments on divesting the US dollar and the West in general were made, South Africa's finance minister Enoch clarified, quote, no one has tabled the issue of a BRICS currency, not even in informal meeting. Setting up a common currency presumes setting up a central bank, and that presupposes losing independence on monetary policy. I don't think any country is ready for that, end quote. Now, India has been neutral this whole time in this whole BRICS thing. They're not expressing actual plan with BRICS and bringing down the West at all. The BRICS members were expecting more rhetoric to come from India in their favor, but it just didn't happen. At this recent summit, the Prime Minister Modi asserted that, quote, they're not ready to go all in with BRICS until the societies of these other countries are future ready. So that's quite vague, but basically means they're not seeing an advantage in going all in on BRICS when they have a strong economic relationship with the West, especially the US. They actually don't need BRICS at all. More on that later. So right after Prime Minister Modi said that on stage at this summit, we saw the Indian flag on the ground. Was it thrown on the ground after this remark was made? I don't think their friends were so happy about India's remarks, especially China, their biggest nemesis. Remember, China is pulling most of the weight in this alliance when it comes to economics and really just power in general. China's leading this whole BRICS groups in the first place. Now, out of all the countries in BRICS, India dislikes China the most. Let's remember they have a long-standing border conflict and it's still going on up to this day. India and China don't like each other or trust each other. So out of the original members, Brazil and South Africa, they're the only ones left that actually get along with each other. And some of the recently added ones, Saudi Arabia and Iran, are absolute rivals and are never going to get along. Now, Bangladeshis expressed they would pay Russian rupees to roll out a new nuclear power plant, but that isn't going to fruition because they lack the money in the first place to get this built. Brazil, they're on board, at least they said they were on first about this whole BRICS thing, but past the surface level, we're seeing them say very different things now. At this recent summit, which we will go through more after more of this important context, President Lula said, quote, "We do not want to be a counterpoint to the G7 or G20 or the US." Now, Brazil has especially been wishy-washy as far as leadership goes and as far as leadership direction. Okay, so we got Egypt as a new BRICS member after this whole summit. Let's review over Egypt though, which, by the way, is a US proxy satellite. Another thing to remember is, when it comes to Egypt, we pay them and their neighbors, Jordan and Israel, not to fight with each other. So Egypt's relationship with the US isn't going to change anytime soon. The BRICS thinking this was an asset to add Egypt is a mistake on their end. Egypt just is going to cooperate with the US and probably a security issue for BRICS letting them in. BRICS is unable to bribe them as much as the US has been and is. Economically and strategically speaking, Egypt is barren of opportunity for BRICS. Let's address Argentina, another new member. Argentina's membership is actually bad for BRICS. They don't exactly have a good history on keeping their word in financial agreements. Yeah, sure, they're kind of wealthy, but they have major diplomatic deficiencies. You see, Argentina assumes everyone should loan them money, and then after they get the loan, they can just ignore paying them back. So they're attracted to BRICS because they're mainly eyeing China, which is the only one with some money in this whole thing, which is not really saying that much with the bad state of China's worsening economy by the day. Argentinians don't have a bone to pick with the US. They just want to find someone dumb enough to loan them money and never pay them back like they always do. Now, Ethiopia. Now, this new addition to the BRICS members is laughable. So let's see. It's in the top 10 poorest countries in the world, and for trade's sake, not so good either. They're landlocked. Chinese have no base case for considering investment in Ethiopia. And we've seen that through China's One Belt, One Road initiative. They've excluded Ethiopia for the reasons just mentioned. Speaking of China, what are China's objectives to extract out of this BRICS alliance? They simply want other countries to be aligned with them so they have more clout walking into Washington and asking for trade concessions. That's all they want. That's their self-serving interest in this. China isn't trusted by the world because it operates from secrecy. We'll touch on that here in a little bit later in the presentation, but let's also not forget, they're notorious for intellectual property theft. So their whole economy is based off of IP theft and trade imbalances, which the latter is coming to an end. More on that later. In South Africa, they aren't exactly bringing much to the table either in this BRICS alliance. They have some of the highest unemployment in the world, and they can barely keep their lights on, literally. South Africa residents only have 12 hours of power a day to use. At this recent summit from last week, a couple of things happened that raises some red flags. First of all, Xi wasn't present for some of the most important opening ceremonies. Some people will say he was busy, but it's important to note that at these opening ceremonies, he was supposed to give key speeches. So this really shows how seriously the Chinese takes BRICS, and that is not so serious. Really, for them and other members, this organization is useful for rhetorical talking points, and that's about it. Now, another thing from this meeting is that BRICS brought 6 new members. Some people see these new additions as a sign of BRICS strengthening, but under the hood, we see quite the opposite. The new members consist of Argentina, Iran, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Now, this is a fatal mistake on BRICS' part. Now, the doomsdayer armchair economists are saying this is a big deal because we have the 3 countries added to BRICS that are in the Persian Gulf, and now this group produces 50 to 60% of the world's oil. So this has to mean the US dollar no longer controls oil and is going to die, and a new BRICS currency will come out shining as the new world reserve currency. But that is a complete joke. So Saudi Arabia sold a few loads of oil in yuan, big deal. Russia sells a few loads in yuan or rupees to dodge the sanctions, but so what? Remember how isolated Russia is now from the world? It's now its own siloed system. Russia doesn't follow anyone but themselves. They have no choice even with BRICS. So the doomsayers are focusing on the addition of Saudi Arabia especially. But this is a big nothing burger. BRICS doesn't have the ability to roll out a powerful energy policy because now they have numerous conflicting powers. Iran, the Saudis, the UAE, and Russia, which is, again, a fatal mistake. These guys hate each other. So why do the Saudis trade oil predominantly with US dollars? Well, it's because them doing that makes them the beneficiary of our military protection and security of the oil locations. However, the US is anticipating in a future point where we won't need Saudi Arabia. So this has made Saudi Arabia considering different countries to consider securitizing their oil if the US protection pulls out. And we'll talk more about that, why the US won't need Saudi Arabia in the future in another video. The Saudis aren't too good at handling their own offensive or defensive military responsibilities. So it's not that they're upset with the US or chose the US dollar because of its world reserve currency status. Can they trust BRICS to fill the security role if the US says no thanks anymore? And another question is, can BRICS even handle filling that role in the first place? So Russia cannot, China definitely cannot. Both lack the ability to deploy resources in range that the Saudis are needing or wanting. And with Iran, Saudi Arabia's biggest rival and foe, being added to BRICS, this is especially not good for BRICS' sake of efficiency. It was a stupid decision made by BRICS, but their thinking was, let's get Iran, who openly expresses hard outlooks on security in that region, and if they added the Saudis, the UAE, and Iran at the same time, you can hedge out conflict in that area of the world. But this was a logical fallacy because adding these 3 together into BRICS now solidifies that now on major regional issues, these new members will never see eye to eye. They're left with 2 outcomes now. Either the Chinese finances the whole entire thing and subsidizes the member countries, which for the poorest BRIC members, that would be fatal. The probability of China doing this is very low. They aren't going to finance these places because they can't benefit or control those places if they do so, let alone pay for influence on its own. Now, the Soviet Union tried to subsidize poor countries they were trying to control, and it didn't exactly work out. They lost a ton of money trying to do this in the 1970s. What also could happen is BRICS just becomes a new version of the old non-aligned movement, which we saw in the 19th century in the past, which didn't really amount to anything either. One could argue that's why they brought in Egypt, because in the past politically, Egypt was a strong component of the non-aligned movement. Same with India. But again, that's only politically, which doesn't mean much. This time around, a new non-aligned movement wouldn't be so non-aligned anymore or work so well. No BRICS member wants to follow China and Russia's individual self-serving goals, nor are they going to follow their lead. There is a lot of chatter online about how BRICS is going to roll out their own global currency. Let's go through how in today's world it just isn't possible for this to happen. Besides the fact they can't even make their own economies do better, let alone get along with each other. Requirements necessary for a global reserve currency. Number 1, the currency has to be big enough and have enough circulation to facilitate every transaction in the world in trade, finance, and other things. Number 2, whoever is running the global reserve currency can't stress about the value of that currency on a day-to-day basis. Countries will lose their trust in you if you go in and manipulate the exchange rates for trade's sake. They'll see that as inconsistent and accessible. Number 3, whatever power runs the global reserve currency now can't have international trade as a large percentage of GDP, which BRICS, they can't get away from the fact that a large percentage of their GDP is from international trade. They can't avoid that. The US doesn't need international trade as much as BRICS rely on it. But with all of these factors defined, no other country besides the US has the capacity to be the reserve currency. And let's not forget, the US Navy presence in all seas and providing protection for countries' import and export shipments, national security, I would say that's a fair price for other countries to pay to have the dollar as the reserve currency. No other country or alliance could pull all of that off at the same time. Now, we saw the euro try to be in competition, but that ultimately failed during their banking system going bad in the 2000s, where the EU's reaction was to commandeer insured bank deposits to pay for the bailouts in the banking crisis, which was a very big political event. So of course, after that happened, smart money saw this and they pulled out of the euro as soon as they could. They didn't see their money safe there. We can look at Japan in recent history. They tried to internationalize their currency, but it failed because the Japanese weren't wanting to crack open their financial sector. So just like the EU, their efforts failed. Now we can look at the reserve currency data, and the bulk of it is the dollar, close to 60% of world reserves. We can see the euro has basically disappeared, and the Japanese yen and Canadian dollar together come to about 4% of world reserve currency holdings. As far as world currency reserves in yuan, guess who holds 30% of the world's yuans? Russia. And they're a great base case to examine and see that the yuans they hold are absolutely dead money, and they haven't been able to convert the yuans into anything useful. So despite the doomsdayers saying the BRICS buck will roll out overnight and at some point will take out the dollar is beyond ludicrous. Some of them argue that the BRICS buck being backed by gold, this could take out the dollar. But for that to be successful, we would need around 1,000 times more gold in the world than we have right now to back up a single currency. So that can't possibly work simply because there isn't enough gold out there to liquefy all of the transactions around the world on a day-to-day basis, let alone long-term. Gold has no value until it's bought or sold with the currency. Remember, gold is traded and valued around the world in, you guessed it, US dollars. How can BRICS come out with a BRICS buck backed by gold, which is valued in dollars? Now, another thing is that the gold bugs always forget. The world, for the most part, keeps their gold at the New York Fed's basement vault. That way, when payments are needed to pay off other countries, the Fed can just move pallets around their vault basement. Where is this gold going to come from? The back, this BRICS currency, which, again, there isn't even enough. Even if you account for all the gold in the world, there isn't enough. And remember, every gold-backed currency in history has failed. And we got the doomsdayers saying BRICS will be able to get around the sanctions and destroy the dollar. In reference to that, remember, the European Union drafted into law that the euro is a subsidiary of the US dollar, and same with Japan. So we only have 3 main currency blocks in the world: the yen, the euro, and the dollar. So let's hypothecate here about the BRICS buck. It would mean that this is somehow outside of the 3 main currency blocks, let alone the 3 largest economies in the world. So then this becomes an issue, and we have to ask ourselves, how can an independent currency be built and trade alongside the euro, yen, and dollars blocks, and at the same time is convertible to all 3 blocks, but at the same time isn't under the whims of the 3 main currency blocks? Make it make sense. Let's say the Xi and Putin fanboys in a magical world are right and the BRICS buck somehow passes through all those logical challenges, then the question is, who controls the BRICS buck? It has to be an independent control. You can only have one, right? Not a dozen or so countries in an unofficial alliance. In order to have a global reserve currency, or really a new currency in general, it has to have a central bank to headquarter it. Where would that be in this BRICS alliance? Would it be in Moscow? Would it be in Beijing? It doesn't sound like the other countries are thrilled by that prospect. So you see how this couldn't be possible. Remember that quote South Africa's Finance Minister Enoch said from this recent summit. He said, quote, "No one has tabled the issue of a BRICS currency, not even in an informal meeting. Setting up a common currency presupposes setting up a central bank, and that presupposes losing independence on monetary policies, and I don't think any country is ready for that," end quote. So either Russia or China controls it, since they are the bulkiest of the BRICS members and the most corrupt. Either one would mean that they now control the BRICS buck in their own self-interest and for their own internal economy would take priority in decision-making. So the Russian sanctions is the biggest case of dollar weaponization we've seen, yet every other country sees no alternative or has officially said they're going to roll out a different option. Now, the dollar is the only game in town. Remember earlier when Russia piled into the yuan during the sanctions, then shortly after tried to give back the Chinese their yuans, but for something else? And the Chinese said no. So Russia had no other choice but to rely on the black market for extracting dollars and fly gold around the world. So BRICS is heavily reliant on global trade, especially China out of them all. What happens in a post-globalization economic model, which we see the US embracing and has been prepping for, while the BRICS is doubling down on this failing, shrinking global trade model. Trade with the US, as far as China goes, we are their biggest trade partner, and that shrank by 20% recently as the US is going elsewhere or domesticating manufacturing onshore after 2020. 90% of the US economy is held in the States, and another 5% in Mexico and China. So 95% of the US economy is kept in North America. So take that for some perspective. No other country of our size can say that. So that means we only have 5% of our economy exposed to the rest of the world. And we also got to come to the fact that the US is now shunning exports and investment in China. Now let's talk about US debt, which the doomsdayers love to pick apart and say we are the worst in that aspect. But what they fail to consider is that a large amount of its foreign debt is really not that big of a deal. That's just the American way. Because we are the world's reserve currency, we also have the ability to dump our debt into other countries, and they take the brunt end of that. And despite that, and we still have control over our money supply. Now, the doomsdayers will highlight that the Chinese hold $3 trillion in US bond holdings and will dump it overnight, someday. They'll scare you saying that the debt will sell for 30 cents on the dollar. Why that isn't going to happen is factors of twofold. First off, US money is mostly digital anyway, so if the Chinese were to ever dump the treasuries on a 70% discount, not only would the Chinese lose their shirt on the value of that, which they can't afford to take the brunt end of, but also the Fed could just click the red button and do more quantitative easing to match the exact number of the 70% of the $3 trillion. So if the Chinese were to do that, it would be good for the US actually, because they'd save us over $2 trillion in a matter of an hour of time. So the US would be delighted if China was dumb enough to do that. Now let's address demographic issues. Demography issues are happening because people around the world are just having less and less kids, and that's been going on for decades. BRICS, though, is largely affected by this demography issue because they had socialist, communist, and fascist regimes who didn't help this problem. In fact, it made it worse. And they're still dealing with those repercussions still up to this day. One example, of course, is the Chinese one-child policy. Now, they finally realized if they left this policy, they wouldn't have enough people to sustain the massive infrastructure the Chinese obsessively prioritize and overly invest in to their detriment. The Chinese economy is overweighted in real estate as a result of the Chinese government prioritizing government spending on state-owned builders, such as Evergrande and others, who have failed and continue so, and recently more major developers missed major bond payments in China. 25% of China's GDP is in the real estate sector, so you can see how a major blow to the Chinese real estate market is going to really make Chinese GDP suffer, and that's been going on for some months. Even with the shutdown of the one-child policy, they finally opened that up, China is still dealing with the demographic problems, and it's only going to get worse. But the Chinese zero-COVID policy was the last nail in the coffin. Now, analysts around the world were expecting the Chinese economy to grow from pent-up demand after the zero-COVID policy was recently lifted in China, but it didn't happen. In fact, consumer spending shrunk after the COVID policy was lifted, which leaves us to the only other place in China where China has found growth, and that is the real estate sector, which we know now the government has stopped funding because they have too much infrastructure compared to people. Chinese exports are going lower and lower by the month, which again is the major driver of their GDP. Consumption is going lower by the month, retail sales are going lower, and imports are down dramatically. So the BRICS economic champion, China, who is responsible for funding 90% of the BRICS Bank, in the grand scheme, is doing awful on a monetary basis. So where's the rest of the money to roll out all of these things the BRICS likes to speculate on going to come from? Now, the US is the healthiest of all the G20 countries in demography, besides Argentina, who is insignificant on the world stage. And let's face it, we have the largest economy by far. We have a very minuscule reliance on global trade, and we have a more effective rule of law compared to the BRICS nations. So based on those three factors, no other country, let alone the BRICS nations, can even come close to having a mechanically sound reserve currency. So with all of that, also with the US having the healthiest demography, and our neighbor Mexico being the second in line, it just so happens to be in North America where the world reserve currency is based on. With the US benefiting the most from the current and ongoing de-globalization without having to lift a finger, BRICS is nothing more than some countries like China and Russia flailing around because they see the problems before mentioned coming to a point of no return for them. Let's play devil's advocate and ask, what happens to the dollar if the US loses the reserve currency status? Doomsdayers are telling you overnight your dollars will become worthless when this happens. Now, it's ridiculous to say the dollar is going away, but I'm saying this to the naysayers out there that despite the point-by-point reasons why it won't, aforementioned, let's map this out. Worst case scenario, the dollar does lose the status like they say it will, but even if that happened, it still wouldn't be a big deal. The US dollar would actually become a normal currency like any other one for that matter. For perspective, realize, in that world, it's still the currency unit for the largest economy in the world by multitude. We wouldn't have as much latitude to dump our debt on other countries. In the long run, this would actually make us politically more fiscal in spending, which would not be a bad thing at all. So you can see, even in the worst case scenario, it's not that big of a deal, contrary to what the doomsdayers are trying to convince you of. Now, I don't have a horse in this. I'm not selling you gold, silver, or crypto. I have no conflict of interest to sell you on the idea that the dollar is going to die. This reminds me of the Q-tards, where they thought that, Q was going after the New World Order and some magic was going to happen, but then nothing happened, of course. And now those same QBs are BRICS bros. They're Xi and Putin lovers, right? So they think that Xi and Putin and BRICS is somehow going against the New World Order when there's so many signs that Xi, Putin, and all these other leaders are in fact New World Order plants. Remember when Putin was part of Klaus Schwab's mentorship? Yeah, you remember that? Remember when Xi has committed all the monstrosities that we've seen? To think that these guys are good guys is absolutely